College of the Environment here at the University of Washington. And I want to begin by acknowledging that the campus and buildings of the University of Washington are on the land of the Coast Salish peoples. This is land which touches the shared waters of all the tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. Thank you all for joining us today, and welcome to our third Amplify! Exclamation point. Amplify is a series of conversations that we hold at the College of the Environment that focus on issues around sharing science with society. And one of the goals of Amplify and of our science communication program more broadly is to shine a light on how science is used outside of academia and help us think more about how we at the university can plug into that. So today we're going to talk with two guests who use science and work with scientists regularly to fulfill their duties of their jobs and to support the mission of their government agencies. And before I introduce our guests, I have a couple of housekeeping items. We are recording this session and it will be available on the college's YouTube channel very shortly. And if you have questions for our guests, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom bar, and we will try to get to as many as we can. So here's what you came for. I am delighted to have Commissioner Hilary Franz and Dr. Letise LaFeir join us today. Both serve in roles at government agencies that manage and protect natural resources. And that means they rely on science to make decisions, but that is only one piece of what they must consider in their day-to-day lives. So Hilary Franz is the Commissioner of Public Lands for the state of Washington and has served in that role since 2017. She's charged with protecting and managing nearly 6 million acres of public land in Washington state. And this isn't just land, it goes from coastal waters and aquatic reserves to working farms and forests, from commercial developments to recreational areas. And she is leading the push to make Washington's lands resilient in the face of climate change by investing in carbon sequestration and in clean energy with wind, solar, and geothermal infrastructure. As a leader of our state's largest wildfire fighting force, she has pushed for new strategies and innovation and resources to protect our communities. In order to restore wildfire resilience in our forest, Commissioner Franz developed a 20-year forest health strategic plan. This plan will make more than 1 million acres of our forest healthier and more resilient to fires. This is a scale and a pace that is unprecedented. Welcome, Commissioner Franz.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Dr. Letise LaFeir is a senior advisor at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. You can see the NOAA crest on her backdrop. And she was sworn into that office by President Biden shortly after his inauguration in January. Congratulations, Dr. LaFeir. Prior to this role, she served in both government and nonprofit sectors to advance goals aligned with NOAA's mission. She was Director of Federal Policy at Resources and Legacy Fund. She was California Ocean Policy Manager at the Monterey Bay Aquarium, the Policy Analyst, and later the National Outreach Coordinator for NOAA's Office of National Marine Sanctuaries, and Director of Government Relations at the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation. She also spent 1 year as a Sea Grant Canals Marine Policy Fellow for now retired Congressman Sam Farr of California. In addition to authoring or co-authoring several scientific publications and a book of poetry, she is a certified scuba diver and has traveled to all 7 continents and the seafloor. She founded Upwelling Consulting and has served on several advisory boards. She's a graduate of Brown University, received a PhD in marine biology from the University of Delaware. Welcome, Dr. LaFeir.
Thank
So-
you, Lisa, for having me.
You bet. So first of all, can I call you Hilary and Letise, or is it Commissioner Franz and Senior Advisor, or Dr. LaFeir?
I always
Please,
say
Letise.
Hilary. I always say Hilary. If you call me commissioner, then you're mad at me. So I'm hoping we aren't starting off that already.
And Dr. LaFeir?
Letise, please.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yep.
So as we start this, this is the university community, and we don't really have a sense of what you do on a day-to-day basis. So tell us a little bit about yourself and give us a glimpse about what a typical day might look for you, knowing that I'm kind of guessing at the level at which you work, you might not have a lot of typical days, but pick one. And Letise, do you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, you definitely hit it on the head. No day is the same. And as you mentioned, after starting on the very first day, 1 p.m., I was sworn in on inauguration day, and it was off to the races. Ever since then, it's been, fast. The plate's been full, and we've been juggling quite a bit. So from one day to the next, it's a combination of making sure that NOAA's at the table. So I like to say one of my primary roles is to advocate for NOAA within the whole of government approach. So we have the broader executive orders and various directives that are whole of government related to equity and climate change and economic recovery. But one of my primary roles is to make sure that NOAA is bringing its assets to bear, and that we're engaging in the various interagency processes, the councils, the commissions, the task forces, and that we're doing that also up through the Department of Commerce. So making sure we're doing that with our other bureaus within the department and the leadership of the department. So I'd say that's true every day. So every day I'm advocating for NOAA, and I'm working to bring our equities into the conversation. Beyond that, though, it's quite a bit of listening, a lot of listening, lots of briefings that we've had to have to come up to date. Making sure that any materials, that are coming through the various programs and offices, I put a policy lens, I look through a policy lens and a political one to think through potential implications, a range of engagement as a liaison to the White House and to Congress on our work. So every day is a little different. And in this Zoom world or this virtual world, it's all back to back. So we don't get the grace period of going from one meeting to another, the travel time. It's click off and join, right? So it's a lot of back-to-back meetings. But overall, I'd say that's my approach. It's everything. It's all the materials, programmatic, it's budget, it's personnel, it's all those things on a daily basis, but primarily just standing up for NOAA and the ocean.
Which we all are really grateful for. It's so great to have you and some of your colleagues in the White House now. It's for the science community, it's really exciting.
It's so nice to say climate and science again universally across the federal government. So let's just start there. I'm pleased that I'm able to use those words in the same sentence. Yes,
absolutely. So Hilary, typical day for you?
Typical day. So most people may not be aware, but we basically, the Department of Natural Resources is 6 agencies. So everything, like you said, from aquatic lands on the coast, the Puget Sound, rivers, lakes, streams, to forest, agriculture, commercial, cell towers, clean energy, to the fact that we regulate the timber industry, small to large companies, as well as fight wildfires. And the other last agency is we oversee Washington State geology. So everything that happens underneath the surface of the earth. Washington State is a pretty volatile place, and I don't mean just politically, but it is also just by its geology. So 5 live volcanoes, the threat of a big earthquake, tsunamis, landslides, we oversee all that work. I think when I stepped in this role, I didn't realize how much of my time was going to be spent on natural disasters, not only responding to it, but trying to prepare for it. where there doesn't seem to be a slow day at the office, especially with given climate change and rapidly changing climate and how it's making our fire season start sooner. Like April, we already had over 220 fires in April. That's 60 more fires than last year and more than the average of 50. So we're already in fire season, and a lot of it's preparation for that. In addition, besides sort of just constantly being on our toes, ready to react to what's happening in front of us in a changing environmental landscape, we have a changing political landscape. We spent about 4 months in legislative session. I tried to move from playing defense all the time by building really strong partnerships and building a lot of support with legislators and the Republicans and Democrats, East and West, so that we're more on working together offensively. But we just finished that. It was all hands on deck to pass some pretty significant investment in legislation. In addition to that is a lot of stakeholder work. You know, this is all about relationships. A lot of people's lives are impacted, whether it's economically, environmentally, socially. And so I spent an enormous amount of time, you know, sort of pre-COVID going to where people are and understanding their economy, understanding how our lands and waters impact their economy, but also their health and the environment, and being on the ground. So I just learned right before I got on this that I'm working on Saturday. So you know, there's very few days off. I'm sure Letise knows that, right? And you can plan your agenda, and it doesn't always go that way, because all of a sudden you're quickly turning around a new crisis.
Well, so speaking of like planning and purposefulness, so, you know, I'm here as a scientist, and we do work that we believe is incredibly relevant to managing natural resources, and sort of deliver it to you and your colleagues in various ways. And you know, like the science has like this clear path, like you should do this or that. And yet in the real world, those pathways are often untenable. So can you talk a little bit about why sometimes the clear path of science, you know, this best available science, is not always the path that ends up being taken? And what are the other considerations besides science that you are wrestling with and are forefront in your mind as you do the work you do as individuals and with stakeholders and other peers? And so when is the science not front and center?
Well, from a policy perspective, there's so many considerations. Science is one of them, and the goal in many cases, especially at places like NOAA, is to make sure that science is the guide, that science is informing the decision making. But once you consider the election cycle, or you consider how much it costs, or you consider what bills you're negotiating if you're a member of Congress and you're trying to decide which policy to support, well, what might you get in return? And so from my perspective, I think the reason why it's not the final choice, you know, the science as a guide isn't the final choice, is because there are all of those other implications that have to be considered within the policy choice. And then you layer on top of that the politics of any given decision. And so as a scientist and a policy professional, I often say that science evolves. We keep learning. You know, we're experiencing that with COVID, right? We have an initial recommendation, and the science continues to inform the next steps, and the science evolves. And on the policy side, I often say that you can never really get the policy right. You can keep improving the policy. You can get close to the right policy, but someone won't be satisfied. Someone won't get what they want. There might be unintended consequences of the policy. And so that's the balancing act when trying to make policy decisions, when you layer in all of those implications. And that's just, you know, one sense of it, and it's case by case, but sometimes it's an easy answer. Science says this, let's do it. Many times, again, when you think of policy and politics, it's not that clear cut. But science should definitely be a foundation and should be a guide. And as a scientist, you know, I'm often having those conversations, but recognize there are these other considerations.
Yeah, that's so interesting, Letise. Particularly, I think as a scientist, we see all the complexity of the science, and then we see the policy process, based on some vague recollection we have of a, civics class we had way back when or something. And you sort of talking about that equal complexity. Hilary, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah. So I obviously have to make a lot of pretty significant decisions like Letise, where it's informed by science. And we have to make sure we don't lose sight of the science amongst all the voices and the cacophony of debate. I find that actually the thing that makes sort of my nights comforting as I make decisions is having the science. It is the one thing that I know it's the compass. If we lose sight of the science, then we're not only failing ourselves and this generation and people, no matter what side they're on, we're failing the next generation, right? So for me, I actually find it as sort of the foundational base. Within that, then the key is actually spending an enormous amount of time getting others to understand that science, to debate it, to nobody can say right up, I'm right, this is the right science. You want that kind of debate. You want to invite a room of people with different backgrounds, different perspectives to wrestle with that science and to push and pull it and stretch it and then be able to go, okay, I think we've guided ourselves through in the right direction to lead the policy. If you don't do that work, I think the policy fails. And I think you also then lose the people who are invested in the outcome. And what I would say is best you can get to a consensus of people. Our forest health work is a perfect example of that, right? Our forest health is trying to prevent the evergreen state turning charcoal black by restoring the health and resiliency of over 1 million acres plus of forests. And for 10 years, people are debating, oh, forest health, that's just so you can log. And the other side, no, that's so it doesn't burn. And there's this debate between a number of different stakeholders. We brought in sort of the preeminent scientists and we invited all the stakeholders to bring their scientists in the room, right? And then we began wrestling with it at the 30,000 foot level. And then as each project goes forward, it's at the landscape level where really the science is key. And it's at the landscape level where I find more people actually can get there to agreement than they could at the 20,000 or 40,000 foot level. It means an enormous amount of time and energy, which sometimes we feel like climate change we don't have. But I always say you got to go slow to go fast. And in a way, it starts with the science and getting people around the table to understand and be informed by that science and guide them together.
Well, I think you also have to be able to get the scientists to be willing to say what they know, what they don't know, and sort of get to that point. I can remember as a Sea Grant fellow on Capitol Hill, having scientists testify saying, well, we're not sure, or we haven't proven that yet. And so hedging their bets, because that's what we do as scientists if we can't say for sure, right? And I think that's changed quite a bit. The more scientists are comfortable having these policy conversations and saying, we're pretty close to certain. There are some options that might change what we're saying. There's some possibilities, but even getting to that point of having the science inform the decision making so that you can drill down to the local or regional level to make a real decision is a key part of it. But I think it's also about what kind of science. So as an example, the administration just rolled out its Conserving and Restoring America the Beautiful campaign, which launches with the commitment to conserve 30% of lands and waters by 2030, but that's just the launching pad. The overall campaign, though, says we need more parks and park poor places, right? We also need to protect certain habitats. There are different types of science that inform those decisions, right? There's the economics, the social science, those other things. And so I think that's why in the end, where will we land? Where will the science guide us? It depends. And that's getting back to the broader policy approach is still it depends on what you're trying to achieve in that place for that moment, what science is the best available and the most appropriate to apply in that particular case, and then leaning into that and making sure, again, as Hilary's saying, that it's the foundation for making better decisions.
Can I jump in? I love, Letise, what you just said about, so I'm going to out myself. I am not a scientist. I'm not an environmental scientist. I'm probably the worst of the worst. I'm an environmental attorney and an environmental policymaker politician. It doesn't get worse than being an attorney and a politician. And I can't tell you how many times in both of those roles, I will look to the scientist like, no, tell me the answer. I must have the answer. Guide me. They're like, well, it's this way or that way, whether they're on the stand in a courtroom or whether I'm trying to lay out a decision that, you know, has huge legal ramifications, statutory ramifications. That has been the hardest part. But at the same time, if you realize that science is constantly evolving, right? We know this, right? Just like nature and the world and our climate, that I've had to get comfortable in the uncertainty of science and be ready to also pivot. If we're trying something and it's not working, all right, we have to pivot, and being able to inform and educate the people about why.
So I have to say, I love what just came out from both of you, and I'm somewhere out there is the rest of my science communication crew. And I'm guessing we're going to grab some of these snippets, because when we do science communication training, which we've done for a third of our faculty now, you know, that always comes up because we are so trained to sort of do this hedging kind of talk. And it's not, it denies the certainty that we actually do have. And so we will be, your words will live on if that's okay. But I also want to pull out a theme that was embedded in what Letise said. And you talked about in the initiative about more parks and protected areas, thinking about park poor landscapes. And to me, that's just kind of the tip of the iceberg about what I'm seeing in your work and in Hilary's work of bringing a lens of equity and inclusion in the science and policy work that you do. And can you tell me a little bit more about that, and particularly how we as scientists can also engage in supporting you in bringing that lens to the work?
Well, I think, you know, as scientists, as research, so again, these worlds collide for me as a scientist and a policy professional. But as scientists, the first thing is, if we want to get to a better answer, do we have enough perspectives? It's not enough to keep doing the same research over and over in the lab or in the field and keep publishing it over and over and then presenting it to the same group of scientists, and, you know, it becomes an echo chamber, somewhat like social media. You know, you start talking to yourself. But if you step back and you not only think about sort of the interdisciplinary nature of science, so the more you think across disciplines, but then the lived experiences that actually inform the questions you ask. That's true in science as well as policy. If you have a diverse set of participants in the research, a diverse set of participants in the decision-making, the questions you ask change. Mm-hmm. And that helps get you to a result that might be less narrow, you know, broader, you know, not quite as narrowly focused. So I'd say the first thing is just stopping and looking around the room and saying, are we asking the same questions over and over and to ourselves? It's that combination. So that's step one, even in thinking about how you design a research project or a research team, or how you choose a location or set up a system. And then on the policy side, again, this informing science. To me, scientific integrity is also threatened if there's discrimination, if certain perspectives are left out. The same as if you throw out data just because you don't like it, right? So there's also the element of equity, even in the basis of scientific integrity. And then if the science is meant to inform decision-making, there has to be some kind of feedback loop, the same way you would in science. You try it again. You'd see if that experiment came out, you know, after 5 trials, is the reason. You don't take it the first time, right? None of us would as scientists. You try it again and you do it again. Same in policymaking. I think if you have a feedback loop with the researchers with a broad perspective, and you think about what decisions are being made and see how it plays out. I think, so that's just that sort of a foundational approach of just thinking about who's in the room, what questions are you asking, what perspectives are you bringing? And then practically, where do you spend your money? And that's same for agencies too. How are we funding work? How are we building capacity? How are we not making things equal, but equitable? Because there are already barriers that certain communities face, but it's not enough just to give one community the same amount of money as another. You have to think about the additional barriers. They might need technical support, they might need transportation, whatever. So that's a broad answer for the first step to achieve equity is to step back and look at the landscape differently and ask different questions and invite different people into the room.
Thank you, Letise. Hilary, do you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, so first, I think one of the things we have to start from is our own agency is about 1% people of color, 14% women. I have found, and shockingly, it wasn't until I got into this role, how much our natural resources world is really pretty white and pretty male, and a lot white and a lot male. And it felt like it was one of those areas that has been sort of really has missed the boat and the tide of like being more inclusive. And so we are right now realizing for us to change that trajectory, we have to start at the K through 12 level, frankly. When most people might say, you don't even do education, but because we fund education, we are engaged in education. And we believe that if we're raising the scientists of tomorrow, and frankly today, that are going to bring the full breadth of perspectives that people need to bring within economic science, social science, and environmental science, then we have got to be inclusive. So that's just first and fundamental where we are trying to change what I think has been a long-standing, and we've got a long ways to go. And in fact, our new legislation just on fire funding and forest restoration has a whole workforce development K through 12 natural resource education program. And some people may say, what? How does that have to do with wildfire? We need to close that gap sooner than we are. I think the other piece is that one of the things that I think has been really helpful is we helped pass the HEAL Act, which is all about every single government agency decision, which is going to be based on science, has to have a race and social justice lens. Not only in where we're putting things that are not positive, and as well as where we're putting things that are positive. So everything from sort of the parks and green spaces to the clean energy facilities, commercial industrial facilities, other things and our hope is through that work that we are going to be changing sort of how we have truly left communities out. In addition, I'll just say and this I think gets at the first question, many of our decisions that we are making every day very much have a foundation of environmental science, but because we are working in communities that many of them have had generational poverty in our rural areas especially, there's a huge economic inequity, and we have to bring that into the equation. And some might think, well, that is sort of diluting the science or not making the science front and center. But what I have found is that when we don't get the economic and environmental balance right, we fail. We fail on the environmental science side, and we fail on the people side. And I could go into many examples in that context. And we've got to start seeing the economy and the environment working together, not working against each other. Frankly, the sooner we can do that, here's what I always say, why we have this expectation that everybody should think about climate change and be concerned about climate change and worried about climate change because it's here, it's now, and it's only going to get worse. And I think about the single mother who has trying to just keep a roof over her family's head, feed 3 kids, get them to school. She doesn't have time to think about climate change. And who are we to say that she should? in my house and safety and comfort, right? And we've got to answer that if we want everybody to be able to be part of this effort to save the planet as well as save ourselves.
You definitely have to integrate the internal with the external. It's a whole person approach. You really do have to think about sort of the wraparound of all the decisions that Hilary and I are having to make. It has to be integrated. What is your own workforce look like? And does it match in any way the communities you're trying to serve, where you're thinking of those nuances? That the intersectional piece is key. That nuance that Hilary hit on at the end is really important. You have to meet people where they are.
You know, it's wonderful to hear you say that, and I know from watching both of you that you actually walk that talk. You don't just say that. So what would be the opportunities that you would see, or pressing issues right now, where science and scientists will or can play a role, knowing on some level that one of the things that we've got here in the audience and with our faculty and students are people who increasingly, our students come to us, and our early career faculty, of course, they care deeply about discovery and the joys of doing science, but they wanted to make a difference. So any advice about from where you sit, you see some opportunities, knowing that there's people listening here.
Go ahead, Letise, if you
Hilary,
want.
do you want to take that?
No,
Do you want to take that one?
I like going after you because I learned so much. I'm soaking up everything you say like a sponge.
There's so many answers to that, Lisa. It's so hard. I mean, from a personal perspective, I would say, where's your passion? So yes, you can discover, you could do more research, but how does that line up with your passion? What is the difference you want to make? Is it to inform decision-making? Is it to help science evolve? Is it, is it just the pure joy of discovery? So that, that's a personal question of, well, what is it that you want to do?
Yeah.
And then I think from a practical one, I'd say test things out before jumping all the way in. So the Canal Fellow, for example, was a way for me to start thinking about the policy implications. So as I was finishing my PhD, I started taking policy courses. I did some policy programs when I wasn't doing my research, just to get a flavor for what does this mean. And then when I went to Capitol Hill, it was more of a chance to say, am I going back to academia, or am I really settling into this policy work? And so there are ways to test that, right? And then also go out to cruises, do lab work, do field work. There are different ways to do that. And there's a whole suite of internships, fellowships, apprenticeships, nonprofit engagement, right? If you want to use your science to work on the nonprofit side, obviously there's local government and a whole range. So I think my advice is, first, check with yourself a little bit, but then test out some things shorter term, a year or 2 years, to get a sense of how your interests and your work can align to help, set a path forward. And then be ready to take some diversions. That is okay. Many of us come in saying, I want to finish my PhD by X year, and then it takes a year longer. And then I want to do, right, there's a plan, but things change. So I think giving yourself some grace also to try things and to take longer or to change paths along the way. So I just say, test it out. And be willing to throw it away. You could become a filmmaker. In the end, you could become a filmmaker and make scientific documentaries. So all I say is that it's the opportunities are broader than we might think when we first start graduate school.
You know what? I so agree with you. There's so many opportunities, and the being open to these less conventional experiences is so key. And oh gosh, so provost listening, it may mean that you take a little bit longer to your degree, but it's the richness of that experience. Oh my goodness. Hilary, I have the sense you have some thoughts on this.
Yeah, it's interesting because when I started out, again, I'm not a scientist, but I started out, I'm like, I want to be an attorney. That's all I want to be in life. Right. And then I got into law. I was very excited about a number of big court cases, environmental court case that went to the Supreme Court that were successful. And then I started getting frustrated with how long it took to get anything done. Every time I won a case on best available science, all of a sudden the fact pattern changed in another case, and that's different science that's applied to it. And I found, sort of midway, all of a sudden that, gosh, you know what? I want to go faster, bolder, visionary, quicker than law provides. And that's when I went into policy making, starting at the local government level. I did nonprofit work, and now I'm at a statewide elected. And I urge people to not, back to Letise and Lisa, your comment of like, we think there's only one path or there's one or two paths. And the reality is each one of us has been put on this planet to forge our own path, to bring our own personality and creativity and passion and energy and courage to our life's path. And when we do that, we're literally setting ourselves free to sort of to forge the new strategy and I think sometimes what I would say is, I'm going to just say is, I urge all scientists, as you're going down this path, please take time to really engage with the people, to engage with policy making. I think sometimes, scientists, back to sort of some of the comments we made earlier, it has a fundamental rubric, right? Tested, proven data, right? And then people come and there's nothing about that that's tested, proven, or has data. And the reality is oftentimes in science gets sitting up on a shelf, and all the scientists say, all that work we did, and why didn't it get implemented, right? And that can be enormously frustrating. The more our scientists can be engaging with, learning about communities and decision making and policy making and different perspectives, whether it's rural and urban, Republican, conservative, you name it, the more you're actually engaging in that, the more your science will be actually implemented, in my mind, right? But also the more that it will be truly influenced from the true total social sense of science, which is social, economic, and environment, trying to forge a path together for success.
Boy,
That
there's
includes
such-
communicating the science. So one of the things Hilary, you made me think of just testing it out, not just going to the big scientific conferences or even testifying in front of Congress. Go volunteer for a room full of fifth graders and explain second graders and get them excited about your science. That's a win, right? So even testing out those different audiences and platforms. I mean, I think what sold me getting to the people is when I was on Capitol Hill, what sold me is when I went to the district and I got to meet the people who were calling DC or who were emailing, and then had a face to them and really thought through, oh, okay, now I understand why I have to help Congressman Farr make better decisions for you. And now I know how my science can help inform that, but it's part of it, right? There's the people element for sure. As graduate students and others, just even as mid-career and older, start thinking through those different audiences and platforms where you can engage even with your science.
You know what, I love hearing this from both of you, and want to make sure, once again, particularly the students and early career people who are listening to this, is if I could sort of roll up what I'm hearing you say, is that a lot of your ability to engage with a diverse set of stakeholders, where diverse in every sort of sense of the word, comes from experiences and growth and empathy and sort of listening that comes from this sort of rich variety of experiences, some of which, I'm sure were at times uncomfortable. Like you sort of go into sort of communities and situations that are not the echo chamber that you're used to, and just applaud both of you, because I think that's a kind of leadership that we so need. Now, you know what? We've got so many comments coming in. Oh my goodness. Okay. Usha Varanasi retired from NOAA, is sending us all sorts of interesting comments. And I'm sure as another senior woman leader, I'm sure she's resonating with a lot of this. Usha, we hear you, and we work within a lot of the legacies of your leadership. Oh, here's one. Nolan asks, and this is a long question, so I'll go slow. Can both of you detail out an example of an experience you had while working on policy that may have ultimately watered down the environmental impact due to political or economic considerations? So a policy that watered down the impact. How do you personally feel about different give and take relationships between these entities? How do you believe these hierarchies could change going forward when climate change is more at the forefront of these issues than ever, especially in climate change oriented federal administration? So this notion of policies getting, if you will, sort of watered down, Nolan's words, and he's both kind of, I think, asking about how you personally feel about sort of the give and takes, but how do you see this going forward?
Hilary, do you want to?
No, you can go ahead. Go ahead.
No.
I'm trying to read Nolan's long question. Very thoughtful, Nolan. Go ahead.
Well, first I'll say that I've become comfortable with the give and take. So I won't say the watering down, but the give and take. I recognize that in policy, there are trade-offs. And in order to get to a decision, there needs to be some trade-offs. Still, the goal is to get to the best policy outcome possible. So I've become comfortable with that. I've also become comfortable with, as Hilary was saying, sometimes it takes a long time. Sometimes the win is getting one word in 100-page. A shall can make all the difference, right? Sometimes it's making sure the wall doesn't close in on you. So just being there to hold the wall is a win. So I'll say broadly, I've become really comfortable with that over time, recognizing it's out of my control, but being here allows me to do these gives and takes and have these wins. And then from the broader perspective of climate, just sort of put something on something Hilary said earlier. Climate is the overarching threat. But if you turn on your tap water and you can't drink it, there are still some places that you have to step back in certain communities or certain situations and say, how can we first just solve your from today to tomorrow problem in order to recognize that we have to protect the planet for your grandkids, right? And so those are also the policy and science disconnects, because science usually is on a longer timeline, much, much, much longer timeline. And policy typically are these short-term increments for a longer-term policy outcome. So that's my overarching answer, but specifically from an administration perspective, because we are operating from a whole of government approach to put climate in everything, it's meant to touch. So we're putting it in our budgeting decisions, our procurement and grants decisions, our facilities decisions, our climate finance decisions. How are we partnering with banks? It's in everything. It's no longer just climate change. We have to tackle this. And then here are all these other things. It's now so embedded, and obviously we've only been here, 15 days or something like that. But because we're taking the approach to integrate climate into decision making across everything, across everything, then that is how ultimately we set this foundation to address climate, but through the lens of we also need fresh clean water and fresh air and parks, and because there are multiple benefits. They're integrated, and they end up feeding on each other in a positive snowball, I guess, a positive snowball effect, I'd say.
So this is a great question. I feel like I spend most of my days in this context between political, economic, and environmental considerations. So I'm thinking specifically, I think just in this context, I think too often when we come at it from one angle, there's a sense of righteousness, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a sense of absolutism. And I find whether you're on the side of an economic righteousness and absolutism or environmental, you're off. We're already off kilter and we're going in the wrong direction. And so I like, and let me just say, our forest is a perfect example. I spent an enormous amount of time in forest, Lisa, you know this. Most of the political issues that we're grappling with are in the context of forests. And the beauty of Zoom is I now know everybody in Washington State and around the United States is surrounded by wood product inside their home, right? And they're clearly using it, and we depend on it. And too often, you know, there's a sense that given climate change, no more trees should be cut, okay? Because it's our greatest carbon sequestration, climate defense and climate offense. At the same time, everyone is still utilizing wood, and the most environmental thing we could do, one could argue, is grow it right in our backyard, grow it right in front of us, so we're not spending an enormous amount of transportation and greenhouse gas emissions. In addition to that, when our mills shut down, our forests are dying in the context of forest health and wildfire, right? There's this delicate balance between sustainable use and sustainable management and sustainable environment. And that, if somebody had the perfect answer to that, and I would love that, but that's a lot of the work we do, where we're constantly having to make sure we don't enter into the conversation with a sense of righteousness, a sense of absolutism, and instead a place that is informed by the science environmental, but also by the importance of sectors or industries that depend on that, because we depend on them, not just for food or our table, but to keep those natural resources still natural resources. That's sort of a convoluted sort of answer, but I think that probably some of the most significant change, if we're going to help our planet and we're going to help our society, is to move from the rhetoric we see every day in the news or on social media about right and wrong and who's right and who's wrong, to a context of listening and understanding and letting that inform the decision making we have to do environmentally as well as economically and socially.
Yeah, I love how these themes between both of your worlds are sort of coming together. So you know what, we've got time for one more question, and this great question has come in from Maddie Brooks, and she writes, hello, I'm co-editor-in-chief for the College of the Environment undergraduate research journal Field Notes. Now I'm inserting some editorial comments here. Field Notes is great, and I'm going to send you guys links. I've got one right here, but I'm going to send you links to it because it's, Maddie, you and your crew are just doing a wonderful job. So Maddie goes on to say, I resonate with both Letise and Hilary's conversation about science communication. Here comes the ask. I would like to know if you as policymakers have any advice for researchers, even at the undergraduate level, to better communicate with policymakers themselves. This generation is, they don't know they're supposed to wait in line until they like have PhDs. Like, you know, this is not undergraduate.
Don't wait in line. Everybody get out of line. I love it.
Yeah, I kind of sort of thought you might. But anyways, advice from Maddie and this incredible collection of undergraduates we have in the College of the Environment that do things like, I mean, they did this on their own. It's not like the dean said, oh, like go make a journal. Like they did this. So.
I mean, I'll just step in. I think that policymakers at the local and the state level, and I'm certain at the federal level too, whether they're legislators or they're city council members and mayors, or whether they're statewide electeds like myself, most of us have no science background. It's true. very limited. And we are swimming in a lot of noise around science and what, is best available science. What is, oh, that's not science. That's, a hoax, conspiracy, and all these things. And I think most policymakers would love to have the opportunity to have scientists at the graduate and undergraduate level work on some of the most exciting, pressing, challenging work, and actually help inform their policy making, and so I think connecting with your local government leaders, your legislators, sharing the work you're doing. That may sound like, oh, are they going to? Most really do want to know that. Fine. I think we need to do more internship programs. The DNR has a great internship program for undergrads. I want to accelerate it and expand it because we have lots of problems and issues and challenges, and we need a lot more people working on them. But we also believe we can help share the work that we do with undergraduate students so they can move from sort of the abstract to the on the ground real application. And I think something the Biden administration, especially with the Conservation Corps, which we are also lifting up and expanding, we should have the Scientist Corps, so that we have, so I think that do not hesitate to reach out to your local legislator, to your local mayor, to say, what are some of the pressing issues? Reach out to nonprofit organizations that are working in advocacy roles to say, I'd like to offer some of my research or do some research that can then become policy. Those are great avenues to begin with.
Yeah, I second that. And I'll also say, just take a moment to ask yourself, how can there's a moment of realization, I think, as we mature in our research as PhD scientists, is to ask, well, now what can I do with this? What can I do with this? And so I know, at least for me personally, I did get to that point where it's like, I'm finding out all of this information about blue crab, and they're a huge part of the economy in Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, but the population is in trouble. Who do I tell? So just taking a moment to say, what work am I doing? What questions could I answer with that? And then, as Hilary's saying, now call the mayor or the Department of Natural Resources, or whomever, and even in your very local, in your very immediate location, to start having that kind of discussion. I think there are also opportunities, again, through fellowships, right? There are the national fellowships for scientists to learn how to communicate their policy. There are the statewide ones. So Sea Grant has national ones, for example, and also Sea Grant has state-based ones. But there are other kinds of fellowships that are tailored for that very purpose, to help train scientists to communicate to policymakers. And then there are programs like, Lisa, I heard you say you have some science communication programs. There's Compass, that the whole focus is to help train scientists to communicate their science. So there are a range of options, I think, to really get a better sense of how do I talk about my science, who do I tell, and what problems can I then solve outside of my immediate research.
Oh, thank you both. And once again, thank you, Maddie, to you and your Field Notes crew, because I think you're doing just what we talked about like 10, 15 minutes ago, about taking these roads less traveled of starting a journal, as an undergraduate. It's so inspiring. So in our last few minutes here, I just want to pause and express really deep gratitude to both you, Letise and Hilary, for joining us today. It means so much to us, particularly in this time when we've been so isolated, to hear your words and hear about your experiences, and to just know that there's a world out there where the work that we do as scientists is being used and being integrated so deeply and so thoughtfully by leaders like yourself. So thank you so much. We've loved hearing about your world and thinking about how policy is informed by science. It's one piece of it, but it's intersectional and so much rich. Thank you for your time. You're busy people. like you spent an hour with us. But I also want to then look out, and I can't, this is not one of those Zooms where I can see you all as little postage stamps, but there are, you know, dozens and dozens of you out there that are the College of the Environment community who has consistently sort of tuned in and paid attention to science communication and supported the Dean's office work in this area. And I deeply appreciate the work that all of you are doing out there. You are having a big impact on our world that is so positive. Thank you all for that. And with that, and with my dog barking in the background telling me it's dinner time, I'm going to say good night to all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Take care. Bye.